The morning sun cast long shadows across the Springfield Police Department parking lot as Officer James Mercer pulled his patrol car into his usual spot. 15 years on the force had earned him that unspoken privilege. The same spot, day after day, right next to the side entrance. He liked routines. He liked control. The station was already buzzing with activity when he pushed through the double doors, nodding curtly to the desk sergeant who barely looked up from her computer screen. Mercer wasn't the type to exchange pleasantries, and most of his colleagues had given up trying years ago. "Mercer!" a voice called from across the room. Lieutenant Rivera waved him over, coffee cup in hand. "Got your assignment for today. West Side Patrol, Maple District." Mercer's jaw tightened visibly. The Maple District was predominantly populated by immigrant families and communities of color, exactly the area where Mercer had racked up the most civilian complaints. "Something wrong with that?" Rivera asked, noticing Mercer's expression. "No, sir," Mercer replied flatly, taking the assignment sheet. "Just wondering why I'm always the one sent to that neighborhood." Rivera sighed, lowering his voice. "Look, James, we've had this conversation. You know how things work. Some officers are better suited to certain districts. You get results there." What Rivera didn't say out loud was what results actually meant. In Mercer's case, it meant more stops, more searches, more arrests, predominantly of black and brown residents. It meant numbers that looked good on departmental reports regardless of how they were achieved. As Mercer walked away, Officer Chen watched from her desk, a concerned look on her face. She'd been on the force just 3 years, but had already witnessed enough of Mercer's conduct to form an opinion. Last month, she'd responded as backup when Mercer had detained a group of teenagers for suspicious loitering. They'd been waiting for the bus after basketball practice. "Still giving him the problem neighborhoods?" Chen asked when Rivera passed her desk. "Not now, Chen," Rivera muttered. "Some battles aren't worth fighting." At his locker, Mercer methodically checked his equipment: gun, taser, handcuffs, radio. Each item inspected with practiced precision. His colleagues had a nickname for his approach to policing that they used behind his back: R.A.C.I.S.T, Rapid Action Confrontational Intervention Strategies and Tactics. The backronym had started as a dark joke among a few officers who'd witnessed his methods firsthand, but it had spread through the department like a virus. Officer Wilson approached, leaning against the neighboring locker. Unlike most others, Wilson didn't avoid Mercer. They'd come through the academy together, formed a bond of sorts. "Hey, got Maple again?" Wilson asked, glancing at the assignment sheet in Mercer's hand. "Always do," Mercer grunted, checking his pepper spray. "Heard about what happened with the Taylor kid last week," Wilson said casually. "His dad filed another complaint." Mercer slammed his locker shut. "Kid matched the description of a robbery suspect. Not my fault he decided to run. When I approached him, he was running because he was late for school, James. He was carrying a textbook, not a weapon." "You weren't there," Mercer snapped. "Split-second decisions. You know how it is." Wilson shook his head slowly. "This is your 6th complaint this year. That's more than the rest of the shift combined. And how many arrests have I made compared to everyone else? How many citations? The brass doesn't care about complaints from those people. They care about numbers." The conversation was interrupted by the shift sergeant calling for morning briefing. The officers filed into the meeting room, taking their usual seats. Mercer sat alone in the back corner, arms crossed over his chest. Chief Thompson stood at the front, flanked by a bulletin board covered with notices and wanted posters. "Before we get started, I need to address something," he began, his voice stern. "We've had an increase in civilian complaints about aggressive enforcement in minority communities. This department will not tolerate racial profiling or excessive force, period." Several officers glanced in Mercer's direction, but he stared straight ahead, expressionless. "Additionally," the chief continued, "the FBI will be conducting community outreach meetings next week. Their director will be in town personally. I expect every officer to be on their best behavior." The briefing continued with updates on recent crimes, suspects to watch for, and community events. Mercer barely listened, mentally preparing for his shift, running through scenarios in his head. After briefing, Mercer headed to his patrol car. The vehicle was his sanctuary, the one place where he felt truly in control. He adjusted his mirrors, checked his onboard computer, and pulled out of the station lot. The Maple District was already alive with morning activity. Street vendors setting up carts, kids walking to school, shopkeepers opening their stores. Mercer drove slowly, eyes scanning constantly, looking for violations, for trouble, for anything out of place. His radio crackled. Unit 47, please respond to a noise complaint at 1435 Oakwood Avenue. Mercer acknowledged the call and headed toward the address. The complaint turned out to be minor, a construction crew starting work too early. After issuing a warning, he continued his patrol. By midday, Mercer had issued 8 citations, 6 to minority drivers for minor infractions like broken taillights or failure to signal lane changes. He'd also conducted 3 Terry stops, brief detentions of pedestrians he deemed suspicious. All 3 were young men of color. None resulted in arrests. When his lunch break came, Mercer parked behind a diner that offered free meals to officers. The owner, a veteran himself, believed in supporting law enforcement. As Mercer ate his burger at the counter, he overheard a conversation from a nearby booth. "I'm telling you, it's getting worse," a middle-aged man was saying. "My boy got stopped twice last week just walking home from practice. Same cop both times." "Did you file a complaint?" his companion asked. "What's the point? Nothing ever happens. Those complaints just disappear into some file." Mercer tensed but kept eating, not turning around. "My cousin works at City Hall," the second man continued. "Says there's one officer with more complaints than anyone else. Department does nothing, protects their own." Mercer left money on the counter and walked out, the conversation following him like an unwelcome shadow. Back at the station that evening, Mercer found a note in his box to report to Internal Affairs. His stomach tightened as he made his way to the office on the 3rd floor. The department's IA division consisted of just 2 investigators who handled all complaints and internal investigations. Investigator Powell looked up from his desk as Mercer entered. "Have a seat, officer." "What's this about?" Mercer asked, remaining standing. "The Taylor incident," Powell replied, tapping a file folder on his desk. "7th complaint this year, 15th related to racial bias in the last 3 years. That's quite a record." "I follow protocols," Mercer said defensively. "Not my fault if certain demographics commit more violations." Powell's expression hardened. "I've reviewed your body camera footage from the incident. The kid was clearly just running to school. You drew your weapon on an unarmed 17-year-old carrying a backpack. He matched a suspect description and refused to comply with orders to stop. He was wearing his school uniform, James. The suspect description was for a man in his 20s wearing a red hoodie." Mercer shifted uncomfortably. From behind, in the moment, "Save it," Powell interrupted. "I'm issuing a formal reprimand, and the chief wants you to attend additional training on bias-free policing." "This is ridiculous," Mercer snapped. "You're hamstringing officers based on political correctness while crime rates soar." Powell leaned forward. "Crime rates in your patrol area aren't higher than anywhere else in the city, despite what you might believe. What is higher is the number of complaints against you personally." The meeting ended with Mercer storming out, slamming the door behind him. In the hallway, he ran into Sergeant Grant from the evening shift. "Tough day?" Grant asked, noting Mercer's expression. "IA's on my back again. Another witch hunt." Grant lowered his voice. "Between us, James, you might want to ease up a bit. Times are changing. The old ways. The department can't protect officers like they used to." "Meaning what?" Mercer challenged. "Meaning there's talk about body cameras being reviewed randomly now, not just when complaints come in. Meaning the FBI's taking an interest in departments with patterns of complaints. Meaning you might want to watch yourself." That night, Mercer sat alone in his apartment, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at the wall covered with commendations and awards from his earlier years on the force. 15 years of service, and what did he have to show for it? A file full of complaints and colleagues who avoided him. Deep down, in a place he rarely acknowledged, Mercer knew something was wrong with his approach. but admitting that would mean admitting that much of his career had been built on a foundation of bias and misconceptions. It would mean facing aspects of himself he wasn't ready to confront. His phone buzzed with a text from Wilson. "Heard about IA, you okay?" Mercer didn't respond. Instead, he poured another drink and tried to convince himself that he was the last of a dying breed, a real cop in a world gone soft. Tomorrow would be another day, another patrol in the Maple District, another chance to prove his methods worked. What he didn't know was that tomorrow would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire Springfield Police Department. The next morning arrived with a heavy blanket of fog covering Springfield, turning familiar streets into mysterious corridors. Officer Mercer pulled out of his driveway earlier than usual, the conversation with Internal Affairs still churning in his mind. The reprimand felt like an unfair stain on his record. In his view, he was just doing what needed to be done to keep the streets safe. Traffic was light as he drove to work, the radio playing softly in the background. A news report caught his attention. The FBI director would be in town today, not next week as the chief had mentioned. Something about a last-minute schedule change. Mercer barely registered the information as he pulled into the station parking lot. The morning briefing was tense. Chief Thompson announced the FBI director's early arrival and emphasized again the importance of professional conduct. Director Washington will be meeting with community leaders in the Maple District this afternoon, the chief explained. He's here as part of a national initiative to improve police-community relations. Mercer suppressed a scoff. Another politician, making promises that would make real policing harder, he thought. "Officer Mercer," the chief called out as the meeting ended. A word. The room emptied quickly, leaving Mercer alone with Chief Thompson. "I received the report from Internal Affairs," the chief began, his voice measured. "This pattern cannot continue." Mercer stood rigidly, eyes fixed on a point above the chief's head. "With all due respect, sir, I'm doing my job. The Maple District needs firm handling." The chief's expression hardened. "That's exactly the attitude I'm concerned about. The Maple District isn't some war zone, Mercer. It's part of our community. Those are citizens you're sworn to protect, not enemy combatants." "Crime statistics," Mercer began. "I've seen the same statistics you have," the chief cut him off. "What they show is that we've been over-policing certain neighborhoods while serious crimes go unsolved. What they show is a breakdown of trust that makes our job harder, not easier." Mercer remained silent, jaw clenched. "I'm reassigning you today," the chief continued. "You'll be on traffic duty on the north side, away from the FBI visit. Consider it a cooling-off period. Sir, I've patrolled Maple for 5 years. I know every corner, every trouble spot. That's part of the problem, Mercer. You see trouble where sometimes there isn't any." The chief sighed, his tone softening slightly. "Look, James, you were a good officer once. Your early record shows that. But something's changed, and until you're willing to recognize that, I need to limit the department's liability." Mercer left the office seething. Traffic duty on the north side, where the wealthy neighborhoods were. Where tickets were contested by expensive lawyers and complaints came from people who played golf with the mayor. It felt like punishment for doing his job too well. Officer Chen passed him in the hallway, noticing his expression. "Everything okay?" she asked cautiously. "Just great," Mercer replied sarcastically. "Been reassigned to babysitting rich people's stop signs." Chen hesitated. "I heard about the Taylor complaint. For what it's worth, I think Powell from IA is being hard on everyone lately." Mercer looked at her with surprise. He wasn't used to sympathy from the younger officers, especially Chen, who he knew disapproved of his methods. "It's a different world now," she continued. "My academy training was probably nothing like yours. We spent weeks on de-escalation, community policing, recognizing implicit bias. Sounds like they're training social workers, not cops," Mercer muttered. Chen shook her head. "No, they're training cops who don't need to rely only on force or intimidation, who can solve problems without creating new ones." She checked her watch. "I need to get to my patrol. Good luck on the north side." The conversation stayed with Mercer as he checked out his vehicle and headed to his new assignment. Traffic duty, Glorified meter-maid work. He'd been a decorated officer, had made more arrests than almost anyone on the force, and this was his reward. The north side was quiet as expected. Mercer drove aimlessly, looking for violations but finding few. By midday, he'd issued only 2 citations, one for an expired registration, another for speeding. His mood darkened with each passing hour. Around 2 p.m., his radio crackled to life. All available units, we have a reported 1050 with injuries at Oak and Maple. Fire and medical en route. A traffic accident with injuries. Finally, something worth responding to. Mercer immediately radioed in. Unit 47 responding from North Boulevard. ETA 7 minutes. 10-4, Unit 47, dispatch replied. Mercer flipped on his lights and siren, accelerating through the quiet suburban streets. The accident was on the border between the north side and the Maple District, technically outside his reassigned area, but close enough that he could justify responding. He arrived at the scene to find a 2-car collision at the intersection. One vehicle, a red pickup truck, had T-boned a black sedan with government plates at the traffic light. The airbags in both vehicles had deployed, and bystanders were already helping the drivers. Mercer parked his patrol car to block traffic and rushed to the sedan, which had taken the brunt of the impact. The driver's side door was crumpled, and he could see someone moving inside, trying to push it open. "Police! Stay still until we check. For injuries," Mercer called out, approaching the vehicle. The window was shattered, giving him a partial view of the driver, a middle-aged black man in a suit shaking glass from his hair. A thin trickle of blood ran down his forehead from a small cut above his eyebrow. "I'm fine," the man said calmly, still struggling with the door. "Just need to get this open. The other driver, is he okay?" "Fire department's on the way. You need to stay put until medical checks you out," Mercer insisted, his tone authoritative. The man stopped pushing against the door and looked directly at Mercer for the first time. "Officer, I appreciate your concern, but I've been in worse situations. I need to make a phone call and check on the other driver." Something about the man's composure irritated Mercer. Here he was, trying to do his job properly, and this guy was ignoring his instructions. "Sir, I need to see some identification," he demanded. The man sighed, reaching slowly into his inner jacket pocket. "My wallet's here. And I should mention, hands where I can see them," Mercer barked, his hand instinctively moving to his holster. The old instincts, the training, the thousands of traffic stops where he'd established control immediately, it all kicked in automatically. The man froze, then very deliberately raised his hands. "Officer, I was reaching for my identification, as you requested. I'm also trying to tell you that I'm the Federal Bureau of Investigation Director, Anthony Washington." Mercer's eyes narrowed with suspicion. This had to be some kind of joke. "Sure you are," he scoffed. "And I'm the Attorney General. Keep your hands visible and step out of the vehicle slowly." By now, a small crowd had gathered. A woman was recording the interaction on her phone. The driver of the pickup truck who had managed to exit his vehicle called out, "Officer, I think that really is the FBI director. I saw on the news he was visiting today." Mercer ignored the bystander. The claim seemed too convenient, too unlikely. What were the chances that the FBI director would be in a car accident, in his jurisdiction, on today of all days? It had to be someone trying to avoid a sobriety test or hiding something else. "I'm going to reach for my credentials very slowly," the man said, his voice remaining remarkably calm. "They're in my inside jacket pocket." "Don't move," Mercer ordered, drawing his weapon and pointing it at the sedan. "Exit the vehicle first, then we'll sort this out." Several gasps came from the growing crowd of onlookers. More phones were raised, recording the scene. The man in the sedan looked at the drawn weapon, then at Mercer, his expression a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Officer, pointing your weapon at me is unnecessary and dangerous. I am complying with your instructions, but I need you to understand who I am and the protocol here." "Get out of the car now," Mercer shouted, adrenaline pumping through his system. This was feeling more and more like a situation spiraling out of control, and his training told him to establish dominance quickly. Just then, another patrol car pulled up. Officer Rodriguez, a 10-year veteran, jumped out and took in the scene with confusion. Mercer, what's going on? Got a suspicious subject, possibly intoxicated, refusing to exit the vehicle and follow. Commands. Mercer called back, gun still trained on the sedan. Rodriguez approached cautiously, glancing between Mercer and the man in the car. As he got closer to the sedan, his eyes widened in recognition. "Oh my God," he muttered, then turned to Mercer. "Put your weapon down right now." "What?" Mercer demanded, not taking his eyes off the subject. "That's Director Washington, Mercer, the FBI director. Lower your weapon immediately." Rodriguez's voice was urgent, almost pleading. Mercer hesitated. Could it actually be true? But why would the FBI director be driving himself? Why would he be alone? It didn't make sense. "Officer," the man in the sedan called out calmly. "Your colleague is correct. I'm Director Washington. I was on my way to a community meeting when this accident occurred. Now I'm going to reach for my credentials, very slowly." The man's composed demeanor finally registered with Mercer. This wasn't how suspects typically acted. With a sinking feeling, he watched as the man carefully extracted a wallet from his jacket and held up an FBI identification card clearly visible. Through the broken window, Rodriguez had approached the sedan and was now looking at the ID. "It's him," he confirmed, turning to Mercer with a look of horror. "Put your gun away, now." Slowly, feeling as though he were moving underwater, Mercer holstered his weapon. The reality of what he'd just done began to crash over him like a tidal wave. He had drawn his gun on the director of the FBI. He had escalated a routine traffic accident into an armed confrontation with one of the highest-ranking law enforcement officials in the country. In the distance, sirens wailed as fire trucks and ambulances approached. Mercer stood frozen, watching as Rodriguez helped Director Washington out of the damaged sedan, apologizing profusely. The crowd of bystanders had grown larger, dozens of phones recording every moment. "Officer Mercer," Rodriguez called over, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Call the station, tell them exactly what's happened, and then wait by your vehicle." As Mercer walked back to his patrol car on legs that felt like lead, he knew, with cold certainty, that his career was over. 15 years of service ended in a single moment of misjudgment and bias. And as the gravity of his actions settled over him for the first time, he began to wonder if perhaps he deserved it. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur for Officer Mercer. He stood by his patrol car, watching as paramedics checked Director Washington for injuries, as fire crews secured the accident scene, as more police officers arrived, including Chief Thompson himself, his face ashen when he recognized the man at the center of the commotion. The chief approached Washington with an outstretched hand, apologies already flowing. Even from a distance, Mercer could see the director's composed demeanor as he spoke with the chief, occasionally glancing in Mercer's direction. Officer Rodriguez stood guard near Mercer, as if worried he might flee the scene. "What were you thinking?" Rodriguez muttered, keeping his voice low so bystanders couldn't hear. "Drawing your weapon on an unarmed civilian after a traffic accident?" "I didn't know who he was," Mercer replied weakly. "That's the point," Rodriguez shot back. "You didn't know, so you assumed the worst, and even if he wasn't the FBI director, pulling your gun was completely unnecessary. He wasn't threatening you, he wasn't resisting, he was just sitting in his car trying to explain who he was." Mercer had no answer. For the first time in years, doubt crept into his mind about his instincts, his approach to policing. The crowd had grown larger, held back by yellow police tape that had been hastily strung around the scene. News vans were beginning to arrive, reporters setting up cameras, preparing for live broadcasts. The story was spreading. A local police officer had drawn his weapon on the FBI director. Lieutenant Rivera approached, his expression grave. "Mercer, I need your badge and gun." "What? Right here? Now?" Mercer asked, disbelief in his voice. "Right here. Right now. You're on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending investigation." Rivera's tone left no room for argument. Slowly, feeling dozens of eyes on him, Mercer unclipped his badge from his uniform and removed his service weapon from its holster. He handed both to Rivera, who placed the gun in an evidence bag. "Report to Internal Affairs tomorrow morning at 9. Rivera said. "And Mercer, get a lawyer." As Rivera walked away, Mercer felt stripped, exposed. Without his badge and gun, he was just a man in a uniform that no longer represented anything. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Text messages from fellow officers who had heard the news, some expressing shock, others offering support, a few simply asking what had happened. He ignored them all. A police SUV pulled up, and the chief approached with Director Washington. The director was pressing a bandage to the small cut on his forehead, but otherwise appeared unharmed. The two men spoke briefly, then Washington got into the SUV, which drove off toward the hospital, standard procedure for accident victims, even those with minor injuries. Chief Thompson marched directly toward Mercer, fury evident in every step. "My office, first thing tomorrow," he barked. "Go home. Don't talk to the press. Don't talk to anyone about this incident." He leaned in closer. "You've done enough damage for one day." With that, the chief turned and headed back toward the crowd of reporters who were shouting questions, cameras flashing. Officer Chen approached, keys in hand. "I'm supposed to drive you back to the station to get your personal vehicle," she said quietly. "Chief's orders." The ride back was silent and tense. Mercer stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of Springfield pass by. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. 15 years of his life dedicated to this job, and in a single moment, he had likely thrown it all away. At the station, officers stopped talking when he entered, eyes following him as he made his way to his locker. The news had traveled fast. He could feel judgment in their stares, could almost hear their thoughts. "There goes Mercer. Finally went too far." He emptied his locker methodically, placing personal items in a cardboard box someone had left on the bench. Photos, spare clothes, protein bars, an old medal from his academy graduation, remnants of a career that had once meant everything to him. Officer Wilson appeared, hovering awkwardly. "What happened out there, James?" Mercer closed his locker with a soft click. "I messed up big time. I heard it was the FBI director. That can't be right." "It's right," Mercer confirmed, picking up his box. "I pulled my gun on the FBI director because he was trying to show me his ID after a car accident." Wilson's face fell. "Oh man, that's bad. Tell me something I don't know." As Mercer headed for the exit, Wilson called after him. "Hey, if you need anything." Mercer nodded without turning around. He doubted he'd be hearing from many colleagues in the coming days. The drive home was a fog. Mercer moved on autopilot, barely registering the traffic around him. When he finally reached his apartment, he sat in his car for a long time, staring at nothing. The reality of what had happened, what he had done, was still sinking in. Inside, he placed the box from his locker on the kitchen counter and turned on the TV. His stomach dropped as he saw aerial footage of the accident scene on the local news channel. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Local officer pulls gun on FBI director after traffic accident." The reporter stood at the scene, microphone in hand. "Sources tell us the officer involved has a history of civilian complaints regarding aggressive tactics and potential racial bias. The Springfield Police Department has placed him on immediate administrative leave while they investigate the incident." Mercer changed the channel, only to find another news station covering the same story. He turned off the TV and slumped onto his couch, head in his hands. His phone rang, his sister, probably having seen the news. He let it go to voicemail. It rang again, and again. Eventually, he turned it off completely. As night fell, Mercer sat in the dark of his living room, replaying the incident over and over in his mind. Why had he drawn his weapon? The man, Director Washington, had made no threatening moves. He had been calmly trying to explain who he was. Had Mercer seen a threat that wasn't there simply because of the color of the man's skin? The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. Morning came after a sleepless night. Mercer showered and dressed mechanically, choosing civilian clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt. It felt strange getting ready to go to the station without his uniform. The news vans were already there when he arrived, reporters clustered near the entrance. Someone spotted him walking from the parking lot, and suddenly microphones were being thrust toward him. "Officer Mercer, can you comment on yesterday's incident? Do you regret drawing your weapon on Director Washington? Were your actions racially motivated? Is it true you have multiple complaints about similar incidents?" Mercer pushed past them without a word, head down, making his way inside where an officer he didn't recognize escorted him to the Internal Affairs office. Investigator Powell was waiting, along with another man in a suit who introduced himself as Special Agent Taylor from the FBI. The room felt small, airless. "This is an initial fact-finding interview," Powell began, placing a recorder on the desk. "We're trying to establish exactly what happened yesterday afternoon at the intersection of Oak and Maple." For the next 2 hours, Mercer recounted the events in excruciating detail. The call about the accident, his arrival at the scene, his interaction with the driver of the black sedan. Both Powell and Agent Taylor asked questions, pressing him on his decision-making process, his reasons for drawing his weapon, his reaction when he learned the man's identity. "I believed he was being uncooperative," Mercer explained, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "When he reached inside his jacket, I perceived a potential threat. Even though he clearly stated he was reaching for his identification, which you had requested?" Agent Taylor asked, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "I've been in situations where suspects claimed to be reaching for ID but were actually going for a weapon," Mercer replied. "And how many times has that actually happened in your 15-year career?" Powell asked. Mercer hesitated. "Twice." "And how many times have you drawn your weapon on a civilian who was actually just reaching for their ID?" The question hung in the air, unanswered because they all knew the number would be much higher. When the interview finally ended, Mercer felt drained. He was informed that a full departmental hearing would be scheduled within the week, and that the FBI would be conducting its own investigation into the incident, as well as reviewing his past conduct for potential civil rights violations. He left the station, pushing past the reporters still camped outside. Mercer felt a weight pressing down on him. His career, his identity, his understanding of himself as a good cop doing a tough job. All of it was being questioned, by others and now by himself. He drove to a small park on the outskirts of town, a place he used to come to think when he was a rookie. Sitting on a bench overlooking a pond, he watched ducks glide across the water, their movements smooth and purposeful. His phone, which he'd turned back on after the interview, buzzed with a text message. It was from Chen. "Press conference at 4, Chief and FBI Director speaking about yesterday." Mercer checked the time, 3:30, just enough time to get home and turn on the TV. Part of him didn't want to watch, didn't want to see himself being discussed, dissected, judged. But a smaller, quieter part whispered that he needed to face this, to understand the full impact of what he had done. As he stood to leave, an older man sitting nearby looked up from his newspaper. The headline about yesterday's incident was clearly visible on the front page. The man made eye contact with Mercer, a flash of recognition crossing his face. Mercer waited for the judgment, the anger, the disgust. Instead, the man simply nodded and said, "Tough day?" "You could say that," Mercer replied. "We all make mistakes," the man said. "The real measure is what we do afterward." The simple wisdom of the statement caught Mercer off guard. He nodded his thanks and walked back to his car, the words echoing in his mind. What would he do afterward? What could he do to make this right? Not just for his career, but for himself. He didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time, he was asking the question. And maybe that was a start. Mercer made it home just in time for the press conference. He sat on the edge of his couch, remote in hand, flipping to the local news channel. The familiar backdrop of the Springfield Police Department press room appeared on screen, a podium front and center with the department's shield prominently displayed. Chief Thompson stood at the microphone, flanked by city officials and, most notably, FBI Director Washington. The director's presence surprised Mercer. He had assumed Washington would have left town immediately after the incident, delegating the fallout to subordinates. "Good afternoon," the chief began, his voice grave. "Yesterday, Our community witnessed an incident that falls far short of the standards we set for our officers and the service we aim to provide our citizens. An officer from this department drew his weapon during a routine traffic accident response, pointing it at a civilian who was later identified as FBI Director Anthony Washington. The cameras flashed as reporters scribbled notes. The chief continued, "The officer in question has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. I want to be absolutely clear. This department does not condone the escalation of force without proper justification. We are committed to serving all members of our community with respect and professionalism." Mercer winced at the public rebuke, even though he had expected nothing less. "I would now like to invite Director Washington to say a few words," the chief concluded, stepping aside. The FBI director approached the podium, the small bandage still visible on his forehead. His composure was remarkable, Mercer thought, given the circumstances. "Thank you, Chief Thompson," Washington began. "First, let me say that I appreciate the swift action taken by the Springfield Police Department in response to yesterday's incident. I came to your city as part of a nationwide initiative to improve relations between law enforcement and the communities they serve, particularly communities of color that have historically experienced disproportionate levels of police scrutiny." He paused, his expression thoughtful. "What happened yesterday was unfortunate, but it presents an opportunity for important conversations about policing in America. This isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about patterns and practices that erode trust between police and the people they're sworn to protect." Mercer felt his defensiveness rising, then forced himself to really listen. "I've spoken with Chief Thompson about using this incident as a catalyst for positive change," Washington continued. "The FBI will be offering resources to help implement additional training and accountability measures. We're not here to point fingers or assign blame, but to solve problems together." A reporter raised her hand. "Director Washington, will you be pressing charges against Officer Mercer?" The director's response was measured. "My focus isn't on punitive measures against an individual officer. My concern is addressing the systemic issues that lead to these situations. That said, there will be a thorough investigation, and appropriate actions will be taken based on those findings." Another reporter called out, "Is it true that Officer Mercer has a history of complaints related to racial bias?" The chief stepped forward to answer. "We cannot comment on personnel matters or ongoing investigations. What I can say is that any pattern of concerning behavior by any officer is taken seriously by this department." The questioning continued for another 20 minutes with both the chief and Director Washington fielding increasingly pointed inquiries about department policies, training procedures, and the specific incident with Mercer. Through it all, Washington maintained a remarkably balanced perspective, neither excusing what had happened nor calling for Mercer's head. When the press conference ended, Mercer turned off the TV and sat in silence. He had expected anger, demands, for his badge, public condemnation. Instead, Director Washington had been measured, even compassionate. It was unsettling in a way Mercer hadn't anticipated. His phone rang. Officer Wilson again. "This time," Mercer answered. "Just checking in," Wilson said. "You watching the press conference?" "Yeah," Mercer replied. "Just finished. Pretty wild that the FBI director isn't pushing harder for your job." Mercer sighed. "Maybe he's leaving that to the department." "Maybe," Wilson agreed. "Or maybe he actually believes what he's saying about systemic change over individual blame. Listen, a bunch of us are meeting at O'Malley's tonight. You should come." Mercer hesitated. The thought of facing his colleagues, of the sideways glances and whispered comments made his stomach churn. "I don't think that's a good idea." "It's just the old crew," Wilson pressed. "People who know you, who've worked with you for years. Nobody's judging." After a moment, Mercer agreed. He needed to get out of his apartment, out of his head. Maybe a few hours with people who didn't see him as just yesterday's headline would help. O'Malley's was a cop bar, the kind of place where badges were more common than business cards. When Mercer walked in around 8, he spotted Wilson at a Corner table with 4 other officers, all veterans, all people he'd worked with for years. He braced himself as he approached. "There he is," called Officer Thompson, raising his beer. "The man who made national news." The comment wasn't said with malice, but Mercer still felt his shoulders tense. He slid into an empty chair, nodding, his thanks as Wilson pushed a beer toward him. "So," Officer Diaz asked, leaning forward, "what really happened out there? The news is saying you just pulled your gun for no reason." Mercer took a long drink before answering. It wasn't no reason, but it wasn't a good reason either. He found himself recounting the incident, not defensively as he had with internal affairs, but plainly, including the thoughts and assumptions that had led to his decisions. When he finished, there was a moment of awkward silence. "Look, officer," Harris said finally, "we've all had split-second decisions we regret. Difference is yours happened to involve the FBI director and about 50 people with camera phones." "It's more than that," Mercer said quietly. "This wasn't a one-time thing. You all know it. I've been heading down this road for a while." The admission hung in the air. No one jumped to contradict him, which told Mercer everything he needed to know. "So what happens now?" Wilson asked. "Hearing next week. Probably lose my job. Possibly face charges." Mercer shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant despite the knot in his stomach. "You got a lawyer?" Diaz asked. "Meeting with one tomorrow. Unions providing counsel." The conversation shifted to other topics after that. Upcoming shift changes, a recent arrest that had gone viral for different reasons, gossip about the new training officer. Normal cop talk. For a while, Mercer could almost pretend things were back to the way they had been before. But as the night wore on, a heaviness settled over him. These were his people, his tribe. For 15 years, being a cop had been his identity, his purpose. Now, all of that was slipping away, and he wasn't sure what would be left. Around midnight, Mercer said his goodbyes and headed home. The night, air was cool, a welcome relief after the stuffy bar. He decided to walk the few blocks to clear his head. As he passed the Maple District, he found himself slowing down. This neighborhood that he had patrolled for years, that he had viewed primarily as a source of problems to manage, looked different in the quiet of night. Families in apartments, above storefronts, small businesses with hand-painted signs, a community center with a mural depicting children of all backgrounds holding hands. Had he ever really seen this place? Or had he only seen what he expected to see? The next morning, Mercer met with the union lawyer, a tired-looking man named Goldstein who had represented officers in trouble for over 20 years. "I'll be straight with you," Goldstein said after reviewing the case files. "This doesn't look good. The department's under pressure to make an example of you, especially with the FBI involved. Best case scenario, you resign with some benefits. Intact. Worst case, termination and possible civil rights charges." "What about fighting it?" Mercer asked. "Arguing that I followed training, that it was a legitimate mistake?" Goldstein shook his head. "Body camera footage is pretty damning, and your history of complaints doesn't help." He leaned forward. "Look, I've seen this play out before. Department needs a sacrifice to appease public opinion. Right now, that's you." The blunt assessment hit Mercer hard, even though he had expected it. "So you're saying there's nothing I can do?" "I didn't say that," Goldstein replied. "I'm saying fighting this head-on is likely to fail, but there might be another approach. I'm listening. Director Washington's big on reform, right? Community. Policing, accountability, all that. What if you got ahead of this? Acknowledge the mistake, express genuine remorse, propose ways to use your experience as a teaching tool for other officers." Mercer frowned. "You want me to fall on my sword?" "I want you to recognize reality," Goldstein countered. "You messed up, big time. But how you handle it from here matters. You can go down fighting, claiming you did nothing wrong when everyone with eyes can see otherwise, or you can be part of the solution." The conversation stayed with Mercer throughout the day. That evening, he found himself driving to the community center he had passed the night before. A sign outside advertised a town hall meeting about police community relations. featuring local leaders and representatives from the police department's Community Outreach Division. Mercer sat in his car for a long time, debating whether to go, and finally he made his decision. He would listen, really listen to what the community had to say. No badge, no gun, no authority. Just a citizen among citizens. The meeting room was packed when he entered. He took a seat in the back, trying to be inconspicuous. Officer Chen was there representing the department along with Lieutenant Rivera. Neither noticed him at first. As community members stood to speak about their experiences with police, some positive, many negative, Mercer found himself really hearing their stories for the first time. A young mother described being pulled over repeatedly while driving her children to school. An elderly man talked about his grandson being detained for matching a description. A business owner explained how increased police presence had driven customers away from his store. These weren't criminals or troublemakers. They were people who felt harassed, targeted, afraid in their own neighborhood. People who had been trying to tell him something for years, something he had refused to hear. When Chen spotted him during a break, she made her way over, surprise evident on her face. "Mercer, what are you doing here?" "Listening," he replied, simply. "Something I should have done a long time ago." Chen studied him for a moment, then nodded. Better late than never. As the meeting resumed, Mercer felt something shift inside him. The anger and defensiveness that had been his companions for so long began to give way to something else. Understanding, regret, and the first faint stirrings of a desire to make things right. Not just for himself, not just for his career, but for the community he had sworn to protect and serve. The path forward wasn't clear yet, but for the first time in years, Mercer was willing to follow where it might lead. The morning of Mercer's disciplinary hearing arrived with gray skies and a steady drizzle that matched his mood. He dressed carefully in his best suit, navy blue, conservative, the one he usually wore to court testimonies. Today, though, he would be the one facing judgment. Goldstein, his lawyer, had called the previous evening with a warning. "They've made up their minds," he'd said. "Tomorrow is just a formality. Be prepared." Mercer had spent the week since the community meeting in a state of deep reflection. He'd reread every complaint filed against him over the years, forcing himself to see them not as annoyances from oversensitive civilians, but as genuine grievances from people who had felt threatened, disrespected, or unfairly targeted by his actions. He'd also written a letter, not to the department or to the review board, but to Director Washington. He wasn't sure if he would ever send it, but the process of putting his thoughts on paper had helped clarify his thinking. The hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock at police headquarters. Mercer arrived early, passing through the lobby where he had once walked with confidence and authority. Now he signed in as a visitor, accepted a temporary pass, and was escorted to the conference room by an officer he barely knew. Inside, the review board was already assembled. 5 senior officers from various divisions plus Chief Thompson and a representative from the city attorney's office. Goldstein was waiting, briefcase open on the table, a resigned expression on his face. "Remember what we discussed," the lawyer murmured as Mercer took his seat. "Let me do most of the talking. Don't get defensive no matter what they say." The hearing began with a formal reading of the charges. Excessive use of force, improper escalation, conduct unbecoming an officer. The incident with Director Washington was described in clinical detail, followed by a summary of Mercer's disciplinary history, 15 years of service that included 27 civilian complaints, 12 internal reviews, and 7 formal reprimands. "Officer Mercer," the board chairperson began, "do you wish to make a statement before we render our decision?" Goldstein touched Mercer's arm, a silent warning to stick to their prepared remarks. A brief, carefully worded statement of regret that admitted no specific wrongdoing while expressing respect for the department's processes. But as Mercer stood, he knew he couldn't say those empty words. Not anymore. "Yes, I do," he said, ignoring Goldstein's sharp intake of breath. "I want to speak honestly about what happened that day. and about my time on the force. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. I've spent 15 years believing I was one of the good ones, Mercer began. I told myself I was tough but fair, that I was protecting the community by being aggressive with those I deemed suspicious, that the complaints against me came from people who just didn't understand what it takes to keep the streets safe. Paused, gathering his thoughts. I was wrong. When I pulled my weapon on Director Washington, it wasn't because he posed any actual threat. It was because I saw a black man in a nice car who didn't immediately defer to my authority, and I defaulted to assumptions I've been making for years. Assumptions about who looks suspicious, who deserves the benefit of the doubt, who needs to be controlled rather than protected. The board members exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the candor. I'm not saying this because I think it will save my job, Mercer continued. I know that's not possible, nor should it be. I'm saying it because it's true and because acknowledging it is the first step toward making sure no other officer repeats my mistakes. When he finished speaking, the conference room remained quiet. Chief Thompson studied him with an expression Mercer couldn't read, not anger or satisfaction, but something more complex. Thank you for your statement, Officer Mercer, the chairperson said finally. The board will now deliberate in private. Please wait outside. In the hallway, Goldstein shook his head. That wasn't the strategy we discussed. I know, Mercer replied, but it was what needed to be said. They didn't have to wait long. Within 30 minutes, they were called back in. The decision was unanimous and unsurprising. Immediate termination of employment, revocation of law enforcement certification, forfeit of pension benefits. Mercer accepted the verdict without protest, surrendered his remaining department property, and walked out of police headquarters for the last time. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, the air heavy with moisture. What will you do now? Goldstein asked as they stood in the parking lot. Mercer shrugged. Honestly, I don't know. Find another job, I guess. Start over. For what it's worth, the lawyer said, that was one of the most honest statements I've heard in 20 years of these hearings. Most officers in your position either fight to the bitter end or offer empty apologies. You did neither. They shook hands, and Mercer watched as Goldstein drove away. Then he sat in his car for a long time, staring at the building where he had spent so much of his adult life, feeling both loss and, unexpectedly, a kind of freedom. 3 days later, Mercer was surprised to receive a phone call from Lieutenant Rivera. There's someone who wants to meet with you, Rivera said. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock at the community center in Maple District. Will you come? Curiosity got the better of him, and the next day, Mercer found himself walking into the same community center where he had attended the town hall meeting. Rivera was waiting in the lobby, along with Officer Chen and, to Mercer's astonishment, Director Washington. Mr. Mercer, the director greeted him, extending his hand. Thank you for coming. Mercer shook the offered hand, confusion evident on his face. I don't understand. Why would you want to see me? I received your letter, Washington replied. It was unexpected, and it got me thinking. The letter. Mercer had finally decided to send it the day after his termination, not expecting a response, certainly not expecting this. Please, let's sit down, Washington suggested, gesturing toward a small meeting room. Inside, they arranged themselves around a table. Director Washington opened a folder containing Mercer's letter and several other documents. Your department made the right decision in terminating your employment, he began directly. Your actions that day and the pattern they represented were incompatible with the responsibilities of a law enforcement officer. Mercer nodded, accepting the assessment. However, Washington continued, your subsequent reflection shows something rare and valuable, the capacity for genuine change. In your letter, you proposed using your experience as a teaching tool for other officers. I think that has merit. Mercer blinked in surprise. You do? The FBI is expanding its training programs on bias in policing, Washington explained. One component involves former officers speaking candidly about their experiences, the thought patterns that led to biased actions, the rationalizations, the wake-up calls. Your perspective could be valuable. You're offering me a job? Mercer asked incredulously. Not exactly, Washington clarified. A consulting role, working with our training division, part-time, at least initially, and contingent on your continued commitment to the kind of honest self-reflection you demonstrated in your letter. Lieutenant Rivera spoke up. The department is also implementing new training protocols. If this arrangement with the FBI works out, we'd be interested in bringing you in to speak with our officers as well. Mercer looked from Washington to Rivera to Chen, still processing what they were proposing. Why would you trust me with this, after what I did? Sometimes, Washington said thoughtfully, the most effective advocates for change are those who have lived on both sides of the issue. You've experienced firsthand how bias can distort judgment, and you've begun the difficult work of confronting your own assumptions. That journey gives you credibility that others might lack. The conversation continued for another hour, discussing logistics, expectations, and boundaries. By the end, Mercer had agreed to a 6-month trial period working with the FBI's training program, with the possibility of extending the arrangement if all parties found it beneficial. As they were preparing to leave, Director Washington held Mercer back for a moment. This is not a redemption story, he said quietly. Not yet. That will depend on what you do with this opportunity. I understand, Mercer replied. And thank you, not just for this, but for how you handled everything from the beginning. You had every right to demand the harshest consequences. Washington shook his head. Punishing one officer doesn't fix a broken system. Real change requires something more difficult: honest conversation, institutional accountability, and people willing to challenge their own beliefs. You've taken the first step on a long road. Let's see where it leads. 6 months later, Mercer stood at the front of a classroom at the FBI training facility, facing 30 new recruits. On the wall behind him was a photo of the intersection where he had drawn his weapon on Director Washington, a visual reminder of what this session was about. My name is James Mercer, he began. For 15 years, I was a police officer. I believed I was serving my community, protecting good people from bad ones. What I didn't understand was how my own biases were shaping who I saw as good and who I saw as bad. Today, I want to talk about the day I pointed my gun at the FBI director, but more importantly, about the 15 years of flawed thinking that led to that moment. As he spoke, he could see the recruits watching him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Some would dismiss his story as irrelevant to their future careers. Others might take its lessons to heart. He couldn't control that. All he could do was speak his truth and hope it made a difference. After the session, as the recruits filed out, Officer Chen, now Sergeant Chen, entered from the back of the room. She had been observing as part of a delegation from Springfield. That was good, she said. Honest. The part about the mental shortcuts we take on patrol, that resonated. Thanks, Mercer replied. How are things at the department? Changing, slowly. The new Community Oversight Board is making a difference, and having Director Washington's continued support has helped push things forward. They walked together toward the exit, their conversation turning to specific reforms being implemented in Springfield. New training protocols, community engagement initiatives, accountability measures. Mercer still felt the loss of his former identity, the career he had built and then destroyed. But in its place was growing something new. Not redemption exactly, but purpose. A chance to help ensure that the mistake that ended his career wouldn't be repeated by the next generation of officers. It wasn't the path he would have chosen. But looking back at the man he had been, the officer who drew his weapon first and asked questions later, he knew it was the path he needed. Not just for himself, but for all the communities that deserved better than what he had once given them.